I'm going to kind of combine some things here so you get several messages from me. First of all, speaking about education and teachers in general, I just want to make sure, and I know that most of you are, aware that we are facing a dire situation regarding employment in education. Last week, I participated in a meeting with teachers from my district and surrounding towns. They brought into focus concerns that I've had. Frequently, in committee and on the floor, I have urged that we do more to recruit, retain, and pay teachers. And here's where we are today. We all know there's a teaching shortage, and that's why we implemented Tier 3 and Tier 4. The fact is that fewer people are going into teaching, and that those who do don't come from the top quarter of their graduating classes like they used to. They come from the middle and below. Not only are we getting fewer teachers, but also less quality teachers. One science teacher explained that when he was hired 20 years ago, there were 200 applicants for the job. Last year's opening garnered 1 applicant. And in those first 5 years, more and more teachers are leaving. Days of teachers like Carlton Urdahl, my first cousin from Litchfield, are very rare. Carlton next year, who teaches in Buffalo, will be entering his 60th straight year in the classroom. 60 years as a teacher. I thought I'd been there a long time at 35 years. But in one of my local schools, next year, 30% have resigned. They're not coming back. They can't make it. Now, I think it's important that I give you some facts. Let's take a look. Paraprofessionals are being paid $11 to $14 an hour. Fast food workers are getting $16, $17 an hour. The paraprofessionals get little, if any, training. They're just pretty much, here you go, start doing your job. Special education teachers are overwhelmed with paperwork. Their prep time doesn't begin to cover the time needed to do IEPs. I've been told that these reports can take up to 70 hours per student over the course of a year. I thought that we'd helped out in teacher insurance years ago. Now one teacher told me that her share of health care insurance is $1,018 a month. The rule of 90 is gone. Teachers have to go longer to retire. We are reaching a crisis. Now this bill doesn't answer it. I don't know what does. Just throwing more money into education isn't the answer either. We have to spend, yes, but we have to do a better job of how we spend. We have a system that isn't attracting quality personnel at high rates anymore, an education system that is dropping into mediocrity and in some places worse. I challenge you in the future to come up with solutions to this crisis. We need to delve deeply into it and not just come up with an answer that's put more money into it. It is part of, but not the only answer for what ails education in Minnesota, and we need to, in the coming session, when many of us are going to be back here, that we put this as the top priority of addressing this problem. Now I need to move to the second item. In this bill, Representative Keeler has a provision to change Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day, add some options for what should be done. I don't have a problem with that. Right now, in Minnesota, there are 4 days. Right now, Columbus Day, Veterans Day, Martin Luther King Day, and President's Day. If a school wants to, they can not have school on those days. If they do have school, they are supposed to have a series of things that are taught in a 1-hour program or whatever about that day. And not all schools are doing that, but that's another situation. And so I thought, and I have now spoken with Representative Keeler about this, and I would hope that next year we can conform the other 3 days to the day that she is working on. And again, I'm willing to work with her on that next year. But what I want to do today is to emphasize President's Day. Now, I've worked for 20 years on issues that affect Indian people in Minnesota. And I know that by talking about Abraham Lincoln, it's a flashpoint for some. I know it's painful for some. But I ask that you bear with me, that you listen. Now, that's hard to do here sometimes. And also maybe learn a little bit. In my years in the classroom, I taught the truth about history. And sometimes truth hurts, but it also leads to healing. And with that, I have some words that I hope can lead to learning, to education, to knowledge, and to healing. So please bear with me. The U.S.-Dakota War of 1862 is the most tragic event in Minnesota history. Great wrongs were done to the Dakota people, who responded by doing wrongs themselves. To this day, accusations and falsehoods abound about the events of 1862. I have taught about it, written about it, and given speeches about that time. The wounds of the U.S.-Dakota War are still open, and with knowledge comes understanding, and with understanding can come healing. I believe that some of the criticisms and maligning of Abraham Lincoln that I've heard around here and other places stems from misinformation and misunderstanding. Today, let's sort through a very complicated moment in our history. In 2009, Governor Pawlenty appointed me to head a commission on the bicentennial of Lincoln's birth. On February 12th, his birthday, I gave a speech about Lincoln in the rotunda. A crowd of spectators was before me and above me, ringing the rotunda from the second floor. And every time I mentioned the name Lincoln, I heard cries, "Exterminator! Murderer!" echoing from above me. Well, when it was over, I walked up, and there were Native people there, and I didn't understand. And I said, why were you doing that? And they said, because he hanged 38 and took our land. Well, I responded, he reprieved the death sentences of 265, and he believed he was saving the lives of others by removing them from Minnesota. The reply was, but he killed 38 and he took our land. And so I recognized the barrier that was. Today, I hope to help us know more about that terrible time, to understand more, and again, to heal. It starts right here with Abraham Lincoln. He watches us today, and please listen. When the war started in Minnesota, our nation was engaged in a great civil war. Our Congress and our president were overwhelmed by the approach of the Confederate Army toward Washington as Lee moved through Maryland. Congress was preoccupied and didn't get around to authorizing the annuity payment due to Dakota people in Minnesota. Some of the Indian people in Minnesota were starving as a result. Officials in Washington weren't being callous. There was no premeditation to hurt Dakota people, just incompetence. There had been no wars with Indians in Minnesota, ever, between the whites and the Dakota or the Ojibwe. When the war ended after 6 weeks in Minnesota, nearly 800 Minnesotans, mostly immigrant families, were dead. Little Crow and about 3,000 of his followers were driven into the Dakotas, and another couple of thousand were left behind, many of whom had not fought in the war and actually had opposed Little Crow. 400, called prisoners of war by whites, were rounded up and tried for war crimes. A 5-member commission made up of officers who fought in the war was established to oversee the proceedings. Now, to call them trials was a stretch. The first dozen or so did receive something resembling due process, although it was a mockery. There were no defense attorneys, little due process, but there was at least a semblance of defense. The initial trials took hours, some even a day, and the commission decided that's too long for 400 cases. The commission determined that changes had to be made to speed things up, and so the proceedings became about 5 minutes. The defendant was brought before them and asked, "Who are you? Were you in a battle? Did you fire a shot?" This line of questioning led to death sentences for 303 Dakota men. Few of them had any idea what they were up against. They believed that they were soldiers fighting for their people. The demand for vengeance in Minnesota was great, and the political pressure enormous. Newspapers urged an immediate execution of all convicted. Alexander Ramsey, the governor, said, "The Sioux Indians of Minnesota must be exterminated or driven forever beyond the borders of this state." General John Pope, commander of the Northwest Military District, sent the names of the 303 to the governor, stating, "The Sioux prisoners will be executed unless the president forbids it, which I am sure he will not." On the contrary, Lincoln ordered a cabinet secretary to Minnesota to instruct General Pope that no Indian would hang without President Lincoln's permission. Pope informed Sibley there can be no executions without Lincoln's sanctions. Lincoln bemoaned the fact that he had not had time to study government dealings with Native people. He said, "We need 2 honest men to watch over each Indian agent. The Indian service must be reformed," he said. "If I get through this war, I am going to see that it is done." He didn't make it to the end of the war. Lincoln demanded that the 303 names be sent to him in Washington. He was concerned about the honesty and the fairness of the government's dealings with Indian people. It cost $400 to send a telegram with the 300 names to Lincoln. This was roundly criticized as unnecessary and too expensive. Lincoln also requested of Pope the full and complete record of these convictions. Ramsey demanded of Lincoln, "I hope the execution of every Sioux Indian condemned by the military court will be at once." Instead, Lincoln ordered 2 men from the Attorney General's office, George Whiting and Francis Ruggles, to review the convictions. It quickly became apparent to them that the court records were sketchy and that a much smaller number were guilty. Politicians, newspapers, and the public blamed Lincoln for holding up the executions. Ramsey suggested that if the federal government was unwilling to execute the condemned Indians, that the state would just do it themselves. The Stillwater newspaper said, "We tell you, Abraham Lincoln, that the remaining 20,000 men of Minnesota will never submit to such ingratitude and wrong. We tell you plainly and soberly, if these convicted murderers are dealt with more leniently than other murderers, the people of the state will take law and vengeance in their own hands, and woe to any member of the hated race that shall be found within our borders." When it was suggested to the president that not hanging 303 Dakota would hurt him and his party in the next election, Lincoln responded, "I will not hang men for votes." General Pope stated, "The people of Minnesota are exasperated to the last degree, and if the guilty are not all executed, I think it nearly impossible to prevent the indiscriminate massacre of all Indians, old men, women, and children." As Lincoln considered what to do about Minnesota, remember what he was facing. The vast number of Minnesotans were crying for Indian blood and opposed to any clemency. Nearly all of Minnesota's political and military leaders demanded immediate executions. Daily reports of thousands of soldiers dying on battlefields caused the anguished president to bemoan the blood on his hands. His dear son Willie had died in the spring. His distraught wife was often bedridden with grief. He couldn't get his general-in-chief to fight, and his beloved nation was being ripped asunder. And now Lincoln had to make decisions about a war in Minnesota. Bishop Whipple from St. Paul told Lincoln, "You can't hang men by the hundreds." Lincoln agreed. Reverend Stephen Riggs asked that Cheskedon, who had saved a white family, be reprieved. On the entreaties of Sarah Wakefield, the woman who Chaska had saved and her family, begged with Lincoln, and the president reprieved the death sentence of Cheskedon. He was given by Whiting and Ruggles the names of 39 men that they believed had committed heinous crimes and deserved to hang. Lincoln carefully wrote their names down. He spelled out the consonants by their sound, using dashes to convey pronunciations as well as he could. Then he added the numbers given each of them at their trials. He granted one more reprieve. But after that, confusion reigned. Names sounded alike. Lincoln wanted to make sure the reprieved weren't confused with the guilty, but the numbers from the trials had been forgotten and didn't match the convicted. The case could be made that many of the 38, some of them anyway, were guilty of murder, but not all. Chaska, after being pardoned, was hanged anyway. After Lincoln said, "Don't hang this man," they hanged him anyway in Minnesota, because when they called out his name, there were 3 Indians whose names sounded alike, and the wrong one stood up. And that's the Chaska that they hanged. And so, on December 26th, 1862, 38 men were hanged in Mankato. Lincoln approved, believing he had done his best to determine that those who died deserved it. As I've noted, they were not all guilty, but based on the information available, Lincoln tried to be judicious and correct. 1,600 of them, many of them families of the 265 reprieved from death, but not freed, were left on the western Minnesota prairie. What should be done? Left to their own designs, mostly women, children, and elderly men were facing starvation without shelter through a harsh Minnesota winter. They were escorted on an arduous journey to Fort Snelling. The enclosure they were placed in had a fence around it, not so much to keep the Dakota in, but the people of St. Paul out. They were fed Army rations. When spring came, 1,300 were left. Some had died, some had left. We don't know what happened to all the missing 300. On March 3rd, 1863, the Indian Removal Act was signed by President Lincoln. He was convinced that they could not survive if left to the devices of Minnesotans bent on revenge. Newspaper editorials and threats from Minnesota leaders validated his concerns. The Dakota left Minnesota and were sent to Crow Creek in South Dakota. Crow Creek was a low point for the Dakota people. At Fort Snelling, even well confined, they were adequately fed. That was not the case at Crow Creek. And so Abraham Lincoln did order the hanging of 38 men while reprieving the death sentences of 265. He believed that the executed had done things that justified execution based upon the information given him by those he had asked to investigate. He did remove most Dakota from Minnesota, firm in the belief that they could not survive here. The Indian Removal Act is still on the books. I sponsored a House resolution to repeal that act, actually quite a few years ago now. And it passed here and was signed by Governor Dayton, but never taken up in Washington. All Dakota and Minnesota would not support it. Concerns over treaty rights and how history is remembered entered in. I will say that in 2013, Secretary of State Mark Ritchie and I, along with, I believe, Representative Schumacher, were at the border of South Dakota down by Pipestone, and we had a ceremony where we welcomed back Dakota people into Minnesota symbolically. The events and the aftermath of the U.S.-Dakota War were horrific on both sides. As I said, the wounds are still open. We must know and understand to heal. But that man did what he believed was right. Abraham Lincoln stood up to Minnesotans filled with hate and tried to stop the poisonous venom of destruction. The mistakes he made were not vindictive. We must consider the time and the place. This actually may have been Lincoln's finest hour in his term as president. At a time when he seemed to be physically bending under the weight of his responsibilities, and he confessed to his cabinet that he was almost ready to hang himself. He took a terrible political risk on behalf of people despised in Minnesota, knowing it would bring him no advantage. Indeed, knowing it would cause him and his cause irreparable harm. This incident, more than any other, defines the character of our most remarkable president. Thank you for your indulgence in listening. I hope it's helpful.